Everybody, this is Joseph Costello, the author of Politics of Ape and Machine, Power as Organization. Um, Joe is kind enough to join us for an interview to talk about his new book. Did you just release the book like very recently, Joe?
Yeah, just about a month ago.
Cool. And yeah, I just finished reading it yesterday, and one thing that occurred to me to ask you about was the fact that it looks like, or you had mentioned actually in the book that you developed this as like a series of separate works. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's basically a collection of essays, but the the first essay is basically the main thing, and then the other parts are kind of back up to that. I think it's kind of interesting because just uh, to do a whole like kind of book length narrative about where things are. I mean, I think it's like almost out of date as soon as you publish it. So I tried to, just do the pieces and say, here's where we are, here's where the pieces are. And the other part of it is people need to start thinking about this stuff and, and putting together in their own minds. So that's what I've tried to do with this.
Yeah, I was actually just saying a minute ago, like I have pretty much no real deep understanding of like tech and science or you talk in the book about actually the problem of specialization and specialized knowledge, and it resonated a lot with me. Like I hold a master's in history, I teach history at the high school level, and then I do a show on politics. I feel like I've sort of specialized knowledge with that stuff, but like very, very, very rudimentary understanding of tech or science or any of these other things you get into in the book. So, um, yeah, I feel like it is important to have these conversations. Absolutely. So, okay, so one question I had was, you talk about in the book the idea of acquiring knowledge being like a virtue in and of itself, and how that kind of leads us to privilege invention and technological development as just like a universal good. Could you talk about that a little bit more, like why that's so problematic?
Um, it's actually it's an idea I took from Oppenheimer. And for your listeners, there's three or four speeches that J. Robert Oppenheimer, guy who developed the atomic bomb, gave in. Who was in many ways a technologist, who gave in like the late 50s, early 60s. And they're really just good, say, here's where we are in human history, and here's how we got here. And literally our politics are not in any way addressing any of these issues. So one of them was, so one of them he did talk about was, he just kind of said it offhandedly, that we consider the more knowledge is is by itself a virtue. And certainly the Greeks thought that. But if you look at from Western perspective, from the Old Testament, was biting the apple, the tree of knowledge. That was the great original sin. So there's that part of it. And the question is you know how we, and I'm basically of the opinion, yeah, that basically everything we can learn is a good thing. But that got transferred into the development of technology. So because there's a difference between science and technology, right? Science is kind of, here's how the world works. Here's how we work. It's an understanding of that. Where technology is taking that knowledge and then manipulating the world in some way or another with that scientific knowledge. But we've taken this idea of kind of a virtue of knowledge and made it like a virtue of technology, that just because we could do it, we can do it. And that's that's really kind of a childish attitude, is basically the best way you can put it. And that's where we're at now. And like, so you hear, like, with a lot of these tech people, they say, well, it can't be stopped, it can't be stopped, and whatever, their profits can't be stopped is what they mean. But that's what I did with this whole book, is about the politics of technology. We need to make technology part of our politics, and part of that is understanding, well, even if we can do this, we shouldn't do this, and there's a little bit of, uh, you know, that we've done that in the past, stopped it, with chemical and biological weapons, more or less. We agreed to do them. And even though we've created all these atomic bombs, no one's used any for 80 years, but that doesn't mean anything. but, um, but we got to get more, understanding that, but not just whether we should create a technology, but then when we create a technology, how does it fit into society? And with an understanding that every technology comes with certain characteristics that once you adopt it, they become part of that society. And so you have to understand that, and you have to understand, well, then how, if we're going to use this technology, do we use it to the best, and use it for, how we want to utilize it, for whatever way you want to utilize it, right? And so, for a perfect example, what is what is compute technology of the last 75 years? The whole compute stuff has been sold, especially since the PC, the PC came in 40 years ago, that it was this great, freeing, thing, and it would be empowering us all. And it's been just the opposite. Compute has just concentrated more and more power, and it's concentrated more and more wealth. And AI is an exponential leap in both those directions. And people have to understand that, And it's interesting. People are very interested in these topics now. That's all I can say. Where for many years you had a hard time talking about any of this, but now, because of AI, everybody's kind of interested.
Yeah, that was something that, and again, I mean, I met you at that talk hosted by Evgenia and Yasha Levine in New York City. And that was something you had actually mentioned at that talk, which I thought was, in a way, an optimistic thing, or a reason for optimism, which was that, you mentioned how the conversation around AI and the fact that AI and the potential it has to overtake so many people's current jobs and, you know, make a lot of our labor obsolete, that the fear from that has actually created, a great interest in having this conversation about technology and the impact of technology and whether or not, like, we should just innovate for innovation's sake, but, more so whether we should focus on, okay, what's the specific impact of this innovation? How is this going to change society for better, for worse? And, you know, you talk a lot in the book how, I think one of the problems with technological innovation is that so much of it is driven by the private sector and it's profit motivated. So it's about how much money people can make off of a technology, and the social impact is like not even a real major concern, which is, I think, a huge problem. But it does, people's awareness is higher than ever. I should have probably mentioned at the beginning, like, you worked for a long time in electoral politics. Um, I know that you kind of agree based on things you've said that young people now especially feel so disenfranchised and so just fed up with the system. And it's actually led to a lot of people just kind of giving up on the electoral process altogether. And I would say, even going a step further than that, starting to lose faith in the idea of democracy at all. And you are like a huge proponent of democracy. It's kind of all over your work. So I guess what I want to ask you is, like, for young people, like, how would you try to kind of sell them on democracy at this point? And that's maybe a weird question, but I actually think authoritarianism is now back in vogue.
Yeah, more and more so.
Yeah, and so how could you sell democracy as like the better system, or as you talk about it in the book, like a more distributed uh, spread of power? Why do you think that's a better system?
Um, why? Well, that was the system I was born into, and so first I'd say, young people should feel upset with the system as it is because it's not working, and and I, in the '80s is when I really did the most campaigns, and then in '92 I did a campaign with Jerry Brown, who was the former governor of California at that point, and the future governor of California. But the whole thing was basically about how the political system was broken, and if we didn't fix the political system, uh, it was only going to get worse. That was 33 years ago, and that's what's happened. And we've not fixed the political system. You know, and so when people say democracy today, especially if it's coming from the political class, they have no idea what it means. And they associate it with this system that is. And I can tell you, this system is not democratic at this point by any any shape or form. And just having elections does not mean democracy. I've worked in Africa on three different campaigns, and I can tell you, if just because you have an election doesn't mean you have a democratic system. It means all of it means to have a much more vigorous system, and elections are just the end point of a democracy, right? And you need to have all this before democracy of education, of talking to each other, of making decisions, of enacting things, right? And then elections are just part of that last step of enacting things. And if you don't have the three or four things before that, like education and talking to each other and trying to come to some consensus on things, the elections are worthless. And that's where we're at today. So it's really important for young people to understand is that, like, look, when the political class talks about democracy, they don't know what it is. I can tell you that they don't know what it is at this point. So they're just using it and saying it. And this system is completely broken. And what democracy is in the end, politics is about us. It's not about me. It's not about I. It's about we. And it's about democracy is about how we come together to decide our future. And what it says in democracy is that each one of us is as equal in making that decision as the other person and deciding where it's going to go. That's what's interesting about, not interesting, that's what's valuable about democracy. And frankly, I think that with all this technology and all this information, the only way it's going to be well utilized is through a democratic form. We have to create some kind of democratic form to allow this thing. Like, all this centralization is just a disaster. And everybody who thinks, all I can say about compute, right? So when you go and these guys, it's kind of funny, but and then if you listen to a lot of these people, uh, they don't know anything except for the technology. And just as importantly, they only know how the technology works now. And once the technology gets entrenched, it keeps building on that thing, and it gets very hard to change. And so all these guys know that. So all you can say about compute, it's basically 80 years old, is that in that time, all it's seen is further concentration of wealth, further concentration of power. And now they're talking about taking away your job. And I have to say to people, and especially if you have an authoritarian system, how do you think you're going to live? Compute none of these guys have been to this point all about, well, Bill Gates hasn't gone and said, well, I made $50 billion and, I think it should go more to people who work at Microsoft and everybody else. None of them said that. Not one of them has said that. So don't think in any way that what's happening now with artificial intelligence, which is a terrible word for this, but it should really be looked at as automation. It's the next exponential step up in automation. It's going to be able to automate a lot of processes. So that's how we have to think. But how do we do that? And certainly there's a lot of jobs no one wants to do. I understand that, and that's okay, and we can automate them, but how you do that and what the social structure is around that, it can't be this current social structure, which a lot of people call corporate capitalism, but I think corporatism is a much better word for it. So it's sad because the system that we have right now, people call democracy, and it's not democracy. It's not functioning, and so now everybody says, "Well, democracy's failing." Well, democracy is not failing. The system that we have of corptocracy, that's failing on a major level. So that's what I would say.
And I got to be honest, like there's clearly a Lenin poster behind me. Like I have my own admitted authoritarian leanings. I was a member of a few different communist parties, and what's interesting actually about CPUSA, which I was a member of for some time, they believe very much in democratic centralism. What I quickly found was democratic centralism became like a term to just sort of dismiss any dissent. But, okay, so one thing I thought about, because you also talk in the book about the early American Republic and how it was this very rare example of like a truly distributed power system, like almost like a close, one of the closest things that we could find in history to like a pure representative form of government. And that coincided with much of early America being, an agrarian based economy where most people did farm work. You talk about in the book how our form of government is sort of out of date, right? And, it's
Absolutely.
in desperate need of an update. Um, and, I would agree with that. I think most people would. So if I'm trying to put all this together, it's like we need a new form of government that is also more distributed, more democratic, and more like a pure, true, real republic. But I would ask, and this might sound a little cynical, do you think or do you have faith that young people, especially people younger than me, who grew up in this system, this is sort of all they know? This
Yeah,
top down
absolutely.
mechanism controlled by oligarchs, especially tech oligarchs, and in many ways, I think young people are less informed than ever, more isolated than ever. Like, do you think that do you think young people, let me just ask bluntly, do you think young people can really learn to behave socially, democratically in the current state of things?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the things about democracy is uh it's basically natural. It's basically what we are. We are social animals, you know. And but if you look at and and you know and technology has shaped us from the beginning, right? Like the 2.5 million years ago, our pre Homo sapien ancestors, they started chipping rocks and creating cutting edges, and then a couple million years later they learned how to harness fire. Both of those things allowed a lot more nutrition and energy to get into us, which allowed the development of our brain. I mean, that's literally what happened. And then you had 10,000 years ago, you had the agrarian revolution, which was another technological revolution, and and it went from us being hunter gatherers and moving around most of the time to being sedentary, and everything developed at that time. Cities are a form of technology or technic, as Lewis Mumford said. But it's like that whole thing. It's like how we come together. That's all part of, we're deciding how to do that, right? So in recorded history, we know there was the ancient Greeks, there was the Roman Republic, and the Roman Republic was the first 500 years of Rome, right? And everybody thinks of Rome, they think of the Roman Empire, but the Roman Republic went for 500 years and it fell at both the height of its wealth and power. And there's just so many similarities. And, that's where the word republic comes from, Republica. Now, that system, both the Greeks and the Romans, they were citizen assemblies. They were participatory. They weren't representative. They were citizen assemblies. And then it went for 1,500 years. There was no republics, no democracy. And then you had a brief brought back classical thinking with the Renaissance. And then with the founding of this republic, which is now 250 years, next year will be 250 years, that was the bringing of modern republicanism into the world. And in 1776, if you looked around the world, there was uh, emperors, kings, what have you, all the hierarchies, all the authoritarianism you want. There was no democracy. There were no republics. Today, 150 countries have republic as part of their official title. So that was like one of the great revolutions of human history. At the same time, we have limited experience with it, and that system is now broke, and it's failing everywhere. It's failing in Africa. It's failing in wherever there's republics or saying republics. It's failing here. It's failing in Europe. It's failing in South America. Okay, so there's reasons for that, and that's what we have to look at now. Um, to get to your question here, so there was Hannah Arendt. I don't know if you know Hannah Arendt, but she was a great thinker, like one of the great small d democratic thinkers in history, right? And she noticed how during these various revolutions spontaneously would form these groups, these councils, like they were in the French Revolution, they were in the American Revolution, these committees of correspondence, and all these other things, where these participatory associations were founded, and they were in. So you French and then in Russia, right? So you got Lenin there in the back. So they were the Soviets. The Soviets were the spontaneous of the Russian people, spontaneous organization of the Russian people, right? And had nothing to do with the Bolsheviks. And so when Lenin got shipped back after the February Revolution, and they saw all these Soviets, I mean, they were astounded by him. So, like, that's what everybody says, like everybody's like, the revolutionary parties are astounded when these, independent councils form. And so, they formed in France, which had no history of democracy. They formed in the Soviet Union, and Lenin, who was a brilliant guy, and so the Bolsheviks took up the slogan "All power to the Soviets," and so that was the whole thing. Like, they went and infiltrated the Soviets, and then when they grabbed power, they disenfranchised the Soviets and just enfranchised the party. That was the whole switch, bait and switch, and Soviet thing. So anyway, all through history, in Poland during the Solidarity movement, same thing. The Civil Rights movement in America, same thing. It was all these spontaneous and organizational things, these independent groups, like it was the small churches across the South that were the organizational base for the civil rights movement. No one talks about that. Everybody thinks about civil rights. Just go Martin Luther King and Washington, the speech on Washington. But the real, where the rubber met the road was in the churches and these little community centers across the South where people got together. So everybody can learn democracy. It's not any kind of hard thing. In fact, it is who we are. We are social animals. We talk to each other, but it's work. You have to do work. It's a lot of work. And we, in this society, gradually over time, over 200 years, we devalued that work necessary to be a citizen. So what you have to do is revalue that, and then go and say, okay, we're coming together and we're deciding. So yes, the simple answer is yes, they can do it. The longer answer is, will they do it? I can't tell you that.
Another thing that actually just came to mind as you were talking now. Um, I I gotta say, so for me, what pushed me more in the radical direction in terms of politics was, I was a regular sort of, I call it standard issue liberal, like in every way. Uh, angry. I came of age during the Iraq War and the rampant, I would call it like naked lying of the Bush administration about that war. And I was just horrified. And so I was a very enthusiastic supporter of Barack Obama. And I was so happy to vote for him in 2008. And pretty much everybody I knew was excited to vote for him. I am from New York, but which is pretty liberal leaning in general. But yeah, so what pushed me a little bit more in the radical direction was the failures of the Democratic Party. And I would say that the hope that I had for figures like Bernie Sanders or AOC or now like Zoran Mamdani, I found that a lot of the hope and I don't know, like excitement I had about those organic, I would call them organic, movements within the party for more progressive change. And I would say they're the thrust of those individuals and what made them so popular and so exciting was the fact that it felt like they really represented the people, and it felt like they were really more democratic figures in a lot of ways than the establishment Democrats. And yet it seemed like all of them eventually were like swallowed by the corruption within the party apparatus and electoral politics as a whole. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess to get to the point or to really formulate this into a question, it would be like, would you say that movements like the progressive Democrats and Bernie and Zoran Mamdani, would you say that those are should we be a little bit weary of trusting individuals like that, or should we try to rally behind people who appear to be more progressive and more democratic oriented and just hope for the best?
No, that's not a good idea. Mandani, I'll leave him aside here because he's not even in office at this point, so we'll see what happens. And he's got a very tough job. Look, very difficult job to be a mayor in America at this point. But that is where, if you want to change American politics, you need to change it at the local level, right? And so one of the things is organizationally that's really really important that we're finding out, because so all over history and our politics comes from this hierarchies, and information was controlled by hierarchies, and like I said before, most of our recorded history, all we knew is hierarchical systems of kings and aristocracies and emperors and things like that. So we don't really understand democratic organization. So that hierarchy is pyramid shaped, and it's like at the top they have the power, and then at the bottom nobody's really got any power. And but science wise, we've come to learn in the last 100 years that that's not how things work. You know, in some in ecologies and systems, order all comes from the bottom. It's distributed order. And that has yet to come into our politics, right? Except for democracy was distributed order. So we have some understanding of that, and so that is what we really have to do. And that's, the subtitle of my book is organization is power, because it's what people have to understand. Everything that you want to talk about in politics about right now is about reorganizing. And so you have to reorganize the structure of the society and create it more distributed and more participatory. Okay, that's easy to say, not so easy to do, but it can be done, and it has been done in the past. So now, I was in the Democratic Party. I came up, and I was this kid from the South Side of Chicago. On my birth certificate, it says father's occupation. It says machine operators. And when I was 19, I went and dropped out of school and worked on the Ted Kennedy for president against Jimmy Carter in 1980. And I went all over the country, ended up last month, I was in Los Angeles for a month, which is very heady stuff for a kid who's 19 years old. And, but what I didn't realize at that point was that that was the end of the New Deal coalition. Really, Teddy's campaign in '80 was really the last gasp of the New Deal coalition, right? Which had run the country for a good, 40 years. So, that's a pretty long time. But nothing ever replaced it. And what happened, Reagan came in, and that was just really, people don't really, the '80s, we're still living with what was creating the '80s. So now that's 40 years later, right? And there's no there's been no alternative provided in that 80 years. And then with Clinton, when Clinton came in '92, he just capitulated to all the Reaganomics stuff, right? So then by the time, and the Democratic Party walked away from its roots as being part of, more of a working people's party, and and it said, oh no, we're all about markets, and this is how everything's going to work, and the era of big government is over, and all that. And there were no alternatives. And then in 2016, so then, and across that time, you had the whole deindustrialization of America. I'm from Chicago. In the '80s, I was doing campaigns like in Decatur, Illinois, and Rockford, Illinois, in Kankakee, in Olney, and all these medium-sized towns in Illinois. And the factories were closing in all of them. And these were places that had developed in the last 100 years based on 4 or 5 manufacturing centers, and they were all closing, and it was just devastating, and nothing's ever replaced them. Okay, nothing's ever replaced them. So, and then the Democrats said this was a good thing, especially the Clintons. Hillary's on the board of Walmart when they're, he's governor of Arkansas, and they're all, this is all good, and we're gonna, and he did China most favored nation, and got rid of Glass-Steagall and all this stuff. I mean, Clinton was what had been a Democrat for 40 years before him. Clinton was none of that. And so by 2016, and then no one in the Democratic Party talked about this, because that's what happened. And none of the Republicans, the Republicans at that point, everybody looked at the Republicans as part of the corporate party. And in 2016, Donald Trump comes and talks to these people who just taken it on the chin for 40 years, and says, you got, they go, oh, great. Someone finally said something, because nobody was saying anything. Right. And at the same time, that's when Bernie came. And, I just really don't like Bernie. And he, and calls himself a socialist at best, whatever that means. And at best, Bernie's like an old New Dealer. And the thing is you couldn't bring back the New Deal because everything had changed, and everything had changed, right? And at the same time, there was no alternative to what, the corporatization of the Democratic Party. And don't get me wrong, corporations were always part of the Democratic Party, but it was the complete corporate. So there was no economic alternative. And so what's happened in the last 10 years is that, like, under socialism, whatever, however you want to call it, that at least was an alternative to what was, corporate power. But we need to be a lot better than that. And because, like, this technology has changed completely. We're not, socialism came out of Europe. It was not an American construct, and it came into America. And so in Europe, in the 19th century, it had no democratic tradition. Where America, it was 100 years of a very solid, democratic tradition at the local level. And like, there were town councils and town meetings, and that's where most of the politics in America, Lincoln really was the one that brought the federal government, started more into it. But for 80 years of the beginning of the republic, no one had any dealings with the federal government. It was all local. That's where it was. And like Hannah Arendt, who I talked about before, she talked about the real mistake of the American Constitution was that it didn't talk about the townships. It didn't include the townships in its government order. And so they eventually lost power. So anyway, I look at socialism at this point, what people throw out as socialism is just as a, alternative to what is, but not a very well thought one, and we're not going to go back. world is a lot different than it was 150 years ago. So the answers aren't going to be the same. And for the answers, um, first off, there was a lot of problems with the answers. I mean, look, Marx had a lot of great ideas, understood completely what was happening with capitalism in a lot of ways, right? But a lot of his theory and things like that were just completely, you know, no basis in reality whatsoever. So anyway, but we got to get well beyond that, and but part of it is re-embracing what this country was, and then at the same time, uh, and again, this is with the Clintons, are very, representative of this. It's not just them. The Cultural Revolution, which came out of the America's 60s, it was a very bourgeois movement. It was run by people who were empowered already. And they never thought about restructuring the organization. They just said, here's the present table, and what we need to do is put more women on there and people of color, and that's it. But that wasn't good enough. And so, and we've now, here we are, and we see that there was big problems with that. So now this is just where we're at. We have to figure out how to do this, and we need some thinking on it, and to go back 150 years and to complete saying, well, this guy had all the answers to what was a technological thing, industrialization, then that's wrong, because the technologies are different today than they were back then. So anyway, we need a lot better thinking about where things are. I understand how people could grasp onto these old things, but they're not sufficient.
I agree with that assessment of the progressive left, and their seemingly, like, I would call them like empty answers to our current problems. And that's why, when they come to power, a lot of times, like, I mean, it's not just their fault either. I think congressional politics, and you talk about this in the book, it's so corrupt, and it's so, like, it's so poorly, I don't know, I don't want to say poorly designed, but like you talk about, like, it's designed for a different period of American history than this one, and so Congress just doesn't function. So even if they have some ideas that are good, none of that ever materializes into policy changes. And we'll see about Zoran Mamdani, like you said. I mean, he's not officially the mayor yet, but I feel very cynical. I know a lot of people on the left do, about the prospects for, like, some sort of renewed New York City. But I wanted to talk a lot about, or a little bit about, the stuff in the book about specialization. Um, I think that, okay, it really resonated with me when I thought back to college, and college, and this is going to be on university radio, so I should be a little careful here. But it reminded me of, like, I worked when I was in college. I worked as a custodian, and I worked an evening shift, and I went to class during the day. And I remember, like, I would speak with professors sometimes about, like, hey, I have work this night, or I have this going on, like, to try and, I don't know, get them to understand, like, I remember my college professors would ask me, like, oh, it'd be like a course requirement. Like, you have to attend this guest lecturer who's coming to the school on such and such date at such and such time. And I would say to the professor, like, hey, I have work. I can't attend this special lecture. And they would say, well, it's mandatory for the course. And it just felt like these people lived and operated in a reality that was, like, divorced from my reality completely. Like, they had no concept of, like, what life is like for, like, a regular working person. And it's almost like very much that stereotype of, like, the ivory tower. Like, they're all with their learned colleagues talking about very, very, very specialized knowledge, but it just has no connection to the real world, quote unquote, real world. So, reading this in your book, you're talking about the problems with specialization, and, the need for having a more total knowledge. But I also thought about how, like, I think this might be why trust in institutions in general is so low right now. And I saw this a lot during COVID, and I have a little bit of a different take on COVID in that, we're really lucky that that virus wasn't worse, because it would have killed way, way, way more people, because people were just, they just had no trust in what the government or what the healthcare, established order was telling them, and they were just flagrantly ignoring like the advice. And it's understandable to a point. There was a lot of like confusion and incorrect assumptions being made, and outright obfuscation of the facts. But I really think like trust in institutions is so low, because institutions are like not connected with the real world and real people anymore. And it's because, I think, partially because of this, you know this privileging of specialized knowledge that we have now. So do you think that's why like trust in institutions is so low today?
Yeah, I certainly part of it. Certainly part of it. And I mean, that's modernity. It's specialization. And I used to kind of blame Adam Smith, division of labor, and say like it was his, thing. But it actually goes back to the scientific revolution, around the 1500s, right? Because science became very specialized, because it was the only way you could really know things well, is to just know a little bit about it. And I mentioned that those Oppenheimer speeches, and he goes into this. He talks about this. It's people thought about it, but so and then the thing is with the modern economy. That also everything became specialized. Along with knowledge, and then what you could do. So you could be very successful in America, extremely successful, by just knowing one thing. Just like knowing one little aspect of how things work. You can make a lot of money, or you can make a very comfortable living, and you do not have to know anything else. And a lot of people don't, which is a problem. Um, so now, part of this is like our knowledge and how we do this. And again, this is one of these things that we have no really good thinking about how to deal with this. And as you said, and I agree 100%, it's part of what's causing all these problems. Like we're not being able to deal with this stuff. So how I've looked at it is politics is the generalization. Politics is how we need to connect all the specializations. And how do you do that? And so that general knowledge needs to lie in our politics, and it doesn't at all. Well, I mean, our politics is brain dead for the most part. So we've got to figure out how to do that, and that's part of what we have to figure out, right? And this is what kind of drives me crazy more than anything else, is the technology and stuff like that. um, you have these people who are, think of like these incredible things and are able to put them in and stuff like that. But socially, we're dead, and politically, we're dead, and our political thinking is just dead. Like I said, with Bernie and AOC and everybody that wants to call themselves socialists, all of a sudden, okay, granted, for 30 years, 40 years, there was no alternative to corporate thinking. And then they just brought this forward. It's lazy. That's all I gotta say. It's lazy. We've gotta think better than that. And then it's not that part of that older thinking can't be part of what we're doing, but we've got to know more than that, because it's a different era of where we're at. So that's what I would say, that absolute specialization is a big problem. But at the same time, uh, the answer is politics. And again, it's like you say democracy, and everybody goes and looks at what this is. And you got to go, and here, you got to go back to understand like what democracy is. And the same thing with politics. When you say politics today, everybody thinks about the show, and say no, 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 not that. It's politics is how we come together to make decisions, and that system is broken. And in ways, this can be the most exciting time ever in this, because we can rethink about how to do all this. Now there's a lot of forces that don't want anybody thinking about this, most of them, so we need to, but that's what we need to do. And it's just a tremendous opportunity if it's looked that way, and it's not easy. I'm not telling anybody it's easy, and it requires work. And it's work that's not valued right now, which is kind of a problem. But part of the problem, part of what we need to do is we need to once again value the citizen and say, okay, there's value in this. And again, that's like, well, how do you do that? Like, I'll tell you one thing, like this universal basic income that just like drives me nuts, because those people are just going to be tossed to the curb. I mean, what are they going to do? What do you do once you got your income? And again, this is where democracy is part of the solution, because democracy is about distributed decision making. And so part of what we need to be in the 21st century, and it was what we always were, but more so, is like decision making. Like one of the things about power, one of the great things about power is because you're able to decide. So now you got to just bring that back down and let everyone be part of how things are decided, not just about like, okay, you know, how you produce things and consume things, but also deciding how this is all done and deciding the structured society. And in that sense, there's more opportunity to kind of, uh, design something new than there's been forever. And, but we're not doing that. We're not even looking at it that way.
I'm thinking a little bit about the part in the book towards the end where you're talking about, I think it's the second to last chapter, where you're talking about the Oracle of Delphi, and the modern incarnation you compare to Oprah, and
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, and then today, I would say a lot of people, and you sort of mentioned this too, they look at like finance and tech people as oracles. I think they even call oh God, what's his name?
Buffett.
Yes, the Oracle
Yeah, yeah.
of Omaha, right? Warren Buffett.
Yeah, right. Right.
And it's sort of just it's quite frightening actually. Like I encourage everybody in the audience, and I actually you too, Joe. I don't know if you saw it, but Alex Karp, who's from Palantir, he gave an interview with the New York Times, some sort of like live on a stage with a live audience sort of deal, and he's basically like falling out of his seat, like twitching, gyrating. He looks like he's on amphetamines or drugs or
He
something. And
probably is.
right, he probably is, and I'm watching him answer some kind of benign question, and the whole thing is like really, it's almost like a movie. Like he looks like a crazy person. I showed it to my wife, who's a social worker, and I'm like, this guy looks like he should be one of your clients, and he looks like a client who you would recommend for a higher level of care. Like, and yet I read an article, and I had to pull it up. It's from the Irish Independent, and the headline was like, eccentric billionaire Alex Karp bets the farm against the logic of markets. Like, it almost doesn't matter how bizarre and crazy these
Yeah,
people really
absolutely.
are. It's just, well, they're rich and successful, and they have specialized knowledge, and therefore they know what they're talking about. And
Right.
any ridiculous thing they say, it's actually just an eccentric billionaire. Like,
Right.
so I don't know. I mean, maybe could you give me some insight into that? Like, why do you think people have just developed this? I would call it bizarre amount of reverence for these figures.
One thing is, I think that is changing. And that's part of what I'm talking about with this AI that is changing. People are finally not trusting these people. But, look, it is America. And along with being the Republic, it was one of the, founding nations of industrialism. And money in America has always not been considered a bad thing. And we've and now this goes back goes back a long way. So these guys are now totally unaccountable, okay, because the corporations control the federal government, and they just say the craziest things. Sam Altman, Bill Gates, go down the list, right? So again, this is where it goes with this specialization that you're talking about. These guys don't know anything else. Most of them don't know anything else. Like at least if you went back, 100 years ago, 80 years ago, especially like the physicists that are responsible for this whole thing with the quantum mechanics and the whole quantum revolution, like Oppenheimer, they were well educated in Greek thought and just history, and they were much more. Where these guys, Bill Gates spent 50 years behind his screen just worrying about how he was going to take everything over with Microsoft. That's all he did. He didn't know anything else, So then he finally retires, and he decides he's going to go talk about whatever he wants, which he's done. But he's got $50 billion in monopoly profits. He is a convicted monopolist. That's what I try to remind everybody. And he says whatever stupid thing he wants. And I'm not against anyone saying whatever stupid thing they want, but when you have all this wealth and power behind you to do it and to then start moving it that way, I have big problems with that. And the big thing was, and here's where we lost it. This is where it goes back to, and I talk about this in the book. Um, with industrialization, like we had an agrarian republic, so the Constitution, when it was created, was 90% of America were farmers. Okay, 90%. So that had an definitely impact about what these institutions were creating. And then industrialism basically was kind of born at the same moment. And the institutions that we created never responded well to industrialism, and the real kind of move to try to save the old republic was with the populists, and they've turned populism into a bad word here, but it comes from the populist movement of the last few decades of the 19th century in America. And that was the small farmers who were trying to keep, and they were enfranchised, politically enfranchised. They like, and again, most of government at that point was at the local level, and more at the state. Washington still wasn't that big a part of it, but the railroads and the telegraph allowed the consolidation of markets and the control by the Eastern banks. And the populists thought, like, how do we do this differently? How do you control this technology? And they lost. I mean, they just lost. And which is unfortunate for all, but there was thinking about that, and that's really kind of some of the first, politics of technology was from American populism. And so from that point on, uh, you know, the corporations just started taking over. And so, so at that time too came, this antitrust, the idea of antitrust. But at the point, the antitrust and the anti-monopolies, the core of that wasn't economic, it was political. These guys were looking at these corporations taking over the government, and they were saying, wait, we can't do this because we're not going to have any control if they control the government. And again, they lost. So, corporate power came, and then, we, or they, you know, uh, trying to think of the right word, popularize, hosannize the CEO, the chairmen of these corporations. And, it's been, really, and then the New Deal, there was a brief going back and saying, okay, this is all wrong and on. But, for the last 50 years, there's been no accountability to these guys. And, the whole thing is, well, this is how it works and this is good for everybody. And finally, people are understanding, well, it's not good for everybody. So that's where we're at. That's where we are. But if you look at what these guys say, and like each generation gets worse, and Sam Altman is like just a complete knucklehead in a lot of this stuff he says. It's just incredible. So, and then it's like, wait, you're the one that's designing the future, and you can say like this? That's ridiculous.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, yeah, like even like I think a lot of people are all too familiar now with like Elon Musk's bizarre eccentricities. And it felt like because Elon was a little bit more centrist in his politics, and he was the apple of the liberal cosmopolitan eye for some time because of the green energy and all that stuff. you know um it felt like people now, because he's shifted, or he had shifted so firmly behind Trump, that people are kind of realizing like how ridiculous and just, stupid some of the stuff that he says is, and that's a positive, I would say. I mean, anyway, so okay, so this has been really good. I sort of only have I have one last question, which is a little silly, but I feel like I have to ask it. So I don't know how familiar you are with Jordan Peterson. Um,
Not sure. You have to give me more because I'm not sure.
so
Name doesn't ring a bell.
it's a positive that you don't know. He's a he's a Canadian psychology professor who became sort of like a self help guru, extremely popular with young men. Since
Yeah,
I'd
I know in general now that you're saying this, but I don't know specifically.
Yeah. So he anyway, long story short, he is a big proponent of like the idea that lobsters provide us a lot of insight into who we are because lobsters have serotonin and such, and that's why you have to conduct your life in a more, I don't know, like orient yourself more towards personal accomplishment and getting your stuff together, whatever. Um, I actually found in the book that it seemed like you were almost advocating more so for us to model ourselves off of fungus and the way that fungus actually distributes power, and
Right.
maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, that's what I was talking about before about how science, how we've learned that order in the natural world is all distributed. It comes from bottom up. And so, how do we do this, right? So, we've thought like from the beginning. So, if you look at, say technology and then science, right? Both like as those progress, and say into the agrarian age, like in the agrarian age, like if we're hunter gatherers and we're going around, there's no great value to having any information, hoarding information or holding it because everybody's experiencing everything at the same time. So it's just like, it's a democratic experience no matter what, how you want to do it. And there's no real value in being able. But once the agrarian system comes in and things start getting more complex, which is with more information, then the control of information becomes a power. And so that has just continued forward now for 10,000 years. And now we're with this new technology where it's all like just, you know, massive amounts of power. I mean, massive amounts of information. And what these guys are building is these systems so that they're the ones that control this information through the whole thing. I mean, very centralized control. Um, it's so funny, lobsters, but we're social animals. That's at heart, we are social animals. That's what Aristotle said. Humanity is by nature a social being. The Greeks learned that. And so, and the whole thing, especially in the last 100 years with modernity, you can add all sorts of things with this. And so, one of the interesting things, right, is that today we are less responsible as an individual for everything we interact with on a daily basis, from lying in bed, you didn't make that bed, getting up, going to the bathroom, you didn't bring that water into the house, going to work, in the car, you didn't build that car. These are all collective things, yet what we go and try to go and say, but you're an individual. And, so I think part of it is like the reaction to this massive, what is really collective society, is try to bring up the individual, like they know like the individual, like, oh, but you're still an individual. And it's all, I mean, it's just literally all. And the thing that's important, and I can't say this, more, emphasize this more, is that our identities come from our collective. That's all of our identities are collective, whether we want to acknowledge that or not. And the whole thing is to be part of creating what that larger system is, to have a role in playing that and designing that, and then acknowledging that. And that's what democracy is, right? And so what if you go back to the Greeks, and it's very important, because this is an interesting. You talk about socialism and all this stuff, but if you go back to the Greeks, there was a distinct, and the Romans, there was a distinct thing between the public and the private. And in the private, that was basically the household, that was a yeoman farm, and you had control over that. Today, that doesn't exist. Nobody, there's 1.5% of America is involved in food production today, as opposed to 90% who were farmers in 250 years ago. So everything that we're part of is creating this, and it's all corporate made at this point, right? It's the corporations are the ones who design all this stuff. And so then this whole thing of like, well, you're an individual, blah, 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 blah. It's kind of a reaction to this, like trying to give people some kind of identity, but you've taken away what is the natural ability of us to associate with each other and create our own identities. And part of our individual identity is that collective design, that ability to collective design. And we don't have that anymore. And that's what we have to recreate.
To wrap things up, I mean, I met you basically at that talk with Yasha and Evgenia, and that was look, it was a small venue, relatively small venue, but it looked like they had a pretty good turnout.
Yeah,
Which is, as you mentioned that evening, that's like the first step, I think, in resolving a lot of the stuff that you're discussing and meeting in person, face to face conversations. I couldn't agree
absolutely.
more. So to wrap things up, The Politics of Ape and Machine, Power as Organization. You can buy it on Amazon. Highly recommend everybody in the audience check it out. Is there anything else you want to plug, Joe, before we end this?
People can also go. I write. It's called Life in the 21st Century, which is on Ghost. Joe Costello, and they can subscribe to that. And I update that more. That's a continuation of the book, let's say. So that's that. And then otherwise, yeah, the whole thing is people need to come together and face to face. That's the most radical politics that of this era, And I'm going to be, going around and talking, and if I'd be happy to talk anywhere people are interested after this, just drop me a line.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, Joe. And yeah, hopefully we'll get to talk again in the future. This was really cool.
I'd be happy to.
All right. Take care.
Thank you very much, Ben.
Later.